Before we talk about whether Sisyphus was happy, we may need to confront a more disturbing possibility. What if millions of people love Albert Camus because they desperately need him to be right? That sounds strange at first. After all, Camus gave us one of the most famous conclusions in modern philosophy. A conclusion repeated in classrooms, podcasts, self-help books, and late-night conversations whenever life begins to feel repetitive. Whenever the days start blending together. Whenever work feels endless. Whenever the future looks suspiciously similar to the present. But here's the mystery. Why did this particular idea survive? Out of thousands of myths, thousands of philosophers, and thousands of competing theories about meaning, why are we still talking about a man pushing the same rock up the same mountain forever? Maybe the answer has nothing to do with the mountain. Maybe it has everything to do with us. Because Sisyphus is not remembered as a king. He is remembered as a condition. A state of existence. A symbol that somehow feels more familiar today than it did 2,000 years ago. Think about it. An alarm clock rings. You get up. You work. You solve problems. You answer emails. You chase goals. You rest. Then tomorrow, the process begins again. Different details. Same structure. And that's where the story becomes dangerous. Most people assume the real punishment of Sisyphus was physical exhaustion. The rock. The climb. The endless labor. But what if the true punishment was something else? What if the punishment was awareness? What if the worst part was knowing exactly what would happen next? Knowing the rock would fall. Knowing the climb would repeat. Knowing there was no final victory waiting at the top. That possibility transforms Sisyphus from a mythological figure into something much more unsettling. He becomes a mirror. And this is where Albert Camus enters the story, not as a storyteller, but as an interpreter. A translator of human experience. Camus looked at this image, a lone figure, a mountain, a falling stone, an endless cycle. And somehow he saw freedom where everyone else saw defeat. But why? Why would a philosopher look directly at meaninglessness and conclude that happiness remains possible? Was he describing reality? Or was he attempting to solve a problem that every conscious human being eventually encounters? Because the moment we ask whether Sisyphus was happy, another question emerges behind it. A larger one. If happiness can exist without victory, then perhaps meaning does not depend on outcomes. But if happiness cannot exist under those conditions, then something far more uncomfortable follows. It means many of our modern stories about resilience, purpose, and fulfillment may be standing on shakier ground than we realize. Notice the contradiction. The more conscious Sisyphus becomes, the more he understands the futility of his situation. Yet Camus argues that this very awareness is what liberates him. That sounds inspiring. It also sounds deeply paradoxical. Because awareness often feels less like freedom and more like burden. The person who sees reality clearly is not always the happiest person in the room. So what exactly did Camus see that others missed? And why does his answer continue to resonate with people living in a world of routines, deadlines, algorithms, and endless repetition? Maybe the strangest detail isn't the boulder. Maybe it's the fact that generations of readers have looked at that falling stone and seen hope. The question is whether that hope was discovered or invented. And that distinction changes everything. If the mountain is not the real problem, then neither is the boulder. That may be the first assumption we need to abandon. Because when people imagine Sisyphus, they usually focus on effort. They see labor, struggle, exhaustion. They imagine a man trapped in an impossible task. But effort alone has never been enough to create despair. People willingly endure extraordinary effort when they believe it leads somewhere. Athletes train for years. Entrepreneurs risk decades. Parents sacrifice sleep, comfort, and certainty. Human beings are remarkably resilient when they can connect suffering to a destination. The deeper question is this: what happens when effort survives, but the destination disappears? That is where the conflict hidden inside the symbol. begins to reveal itself. The image of the mountain contains a strange psychological inversion. Normally, the summit is the reward. The summit justifies the climb. The summit transforms pain into meaning. But in Sisyphus' world, the summit has been emptied out. There is no victory waiting there. No final achievement. No permanent transformation. Only a brief moment before the stone falls again. And that changes everything. Because the mountain is no longer a path. It becomes a loop. A machine. A system that consumes effort while refusing to produce completion. Notice how modern this feels. Not because our lives are identical to Sisyphus, but because many of the structures around us operate according to a similar logic. We finish one project and another appears. We reach one goal and immediately create the next. We solve one problem and discover 3 more behind it. The promised finish line keeps moving. And yet most people continue. Why? This is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. If human beings truly require ultimate meaning, then civilizations built on endless cycles should collapse under their own psychological weight. But they don't. People continue working. Creating. Building. Loving. Planning. Even while knowing that every achievement is temporary. So perhaps the human mind is not as dependent on final answers as we assume. Or perhaps something else is happening entirely. This is the possibility that makes Camus so fascinating. He was not simply asking whether life has meaning. He was asking what happens after a person realizes that the universe may never provide one. Most philosophies attempt to solve the problem by pointing upward. Toward God. Toward destiny. Toward history. Toward progress. Toward some ultimate framework that explains why everything matters. Camus does something unusual. He removes the guarantee. Then he asks whether a human being can continue anyway. That sounds courageous. But it also raises a troubling possibility. What if continuing is not evidence of freedom? What if continuing is evidence of necessity? After all, Sisyphus does not choose whether the stone exists. He does not choose whether gravity exists. He does not choose the mountain. The conditions are already there. The only remaining question is how consciousness responds to them. And suddenly the story becomes less about happiness and more about awareness. Because awareness creates a burden. The person who sees the loop cannot return to ignorance. The person who recognizes repetition cannot fully pretend it is novelty. The person who notices that every summit eventually becomes another starting point begins carrying a different kind of weight. A weight inside the mind. This may be why one image remains so powerful, a solitary figure walking back down the mountain after the stone has fallen. Not climbing. Not struggling. Not succeeding. Simply descending. Alone with the knowledge of what comes next. That moment may be the true center of the myth. Because the greatest conflict is not between a man and a rock. It is between consciousness and repetition. And if that is true, then a far more unsettling question emerges. Was Camus trying to explain what happens in that moment of awareness, or was he trying to protect us from what that moment might actually reveal? But there is a deeper contradiction hiding beneath all of this. We have been treating the question as if there are only 2 possibilities. Either the absurd destroys a person, or the person somehow transcends the absurd. Either the mountain wins, or the climber wins. What if that entire framework is wrong? What if the most important thing about Sisyphus is that nobody wins at all? This is where the comforting version of the story begins to crack. Because many modern interpretations quietly transform Sisyphus into a hero of resilience. A symbol of grit. A model of perseverance. The kind of figure who teaches us to keep going no matter what. But that interpretation introduces a strange problem. Perseverance usually assumes a future reward. Resilience usually assumes recovery. Endurance usually assumes a destination. Remove the destination, and those words begin to change their meaning. Suddenly perseverance starts looking less like triumph and more like adaptation. And adaptation is not always freedom. Sometimes it is survival. That distinction matters. Because if a person adapts to an impossible condition, we instinctively admire them. We call them strong. We call them courageous. But if a person adapts because there is no alternative, what exactly are we celebrating? Notice how quickly the scale expands. What begins as a question about one mythological figure becomes a question about entire societies. Human civilizations are built on repetition. Work repeats. Economies repeat. Institutions repeat. Generations repeat. Even history often appears to repeat itself in new forms. Every civilization creates its own version of the mountain. Every generation inherits its own version of the stone. And every generation develops stories that make the burden bearable. That is where the role of Camus becomes more complicated. Perhaps he was never simply analyzing a myth. Perhaps he was analyzing a psychological necessity. A civilization cannot function if enough people conclude that effort is meaningless. A culture cannot sustain itself if nobody believes tomorrow is worth investing in. A person cannot easily build a life if every goal appears empty before it is achieved. So the need for meaning becomes enormous. Maybe even unavoidable. And here the contradiction sharpens. Camus rejects traditional guarantees of meaning. Yet he still arrives at a conclusion that allows action to continue. He removes the destination, but somehow preserves the journey. He removes cosmic purpose, but somehow preserves human dignity. The question is how? What mechanism makes that possible? Because not everyone responds to awareness in the same way. For some people, greater awareness creates liberation. For others, it creates paralysis. For some, seeing the loop inspires rebellion. For others, it inspires exhaustion. The same realization can produce opposite outcomes. Which raises a troubling possibility. What if awareness itself is neutral? What if consciousness does not automatically create freedom? What if something else must happen first? Consider one of the most haunting images in this entire discussion. Not the stone. Not the mountain. But the empty summit. A destination stripped of meaning. A peak that offers no reward. A finish line that refuses to finish anything. That image reaches far beyond mythology. People encounter it after achieving success. After reaching career goals. After acquiring wealth. After obtaining recognition. They arrive expecting transformation and discover something unsettling. The summit changes. The longing remains. The stone falls again. And suddenly Sisyphus no longer looks like an ancient figure trapped in a forgotten myth. He looks like a recurring pattern embedded within human experience itself. Which creates an even greater mystery. If the real struggle was never against the mountain, and if awareness alone cannot explain why some people endure while others break, then perhaps Camus was looking in the right place but asking the wrong question. Perhaps the mystery is not why Sisyphus continues. Perhaps the mystery is what happens during the walk back down. Because that silent descent may contain something far more important than either hope or despair. And it is exactly there that the next layer of the puzzle begins to emerge. What if the most important symbol in this entire philosophy is not the stone, not the mountain, and not even the man? What if the real symbol is the space between them? The empty interval. The moment after collapse and before effort begins again. Because that is where a remarkable shift starts to appear. Up to this point, it is tempting to view Sisyphus as a symbol of endurance. But endurance is not the deepest layer. Endurance simply describes what happens. It does not explain why it happens. And this is where a hidden revelation begins to emerge. The role of Sisyphus is not to teach persistence. His role is to expose a question that most people spend their lives avoiding. What remains of a human being when every external justification is removed? No reward. No final victory. No guarantee that history will remember you. No promise that the universe is paying attention. Strip away every external source of validation and something unexpected becomes visible. The real conflict is no longer between a person and circumstance. It becomes a conflict between consciousness and dependency. Most people believe meaning is something they discover. Something waiting somewhere ahead. A destination. A future achievement. A relationship. A breakthrough. A legacy. But Sisyphus introduces a dangerous possibility. What if meaning is not found ahead at all? What if the search itself has quietly become another stone rolling uphill? Notice the inversion. The man is supposed to be the prisoner. The task is supposed to be the prison. Yet the deeper symbol suggests something else. The prison may be the belief that fulfillment always exists somewhere beyond the present moment. One more promotion. One more accomplishment. One more milestone. One more mountain. This is why the image remains so powerful. A figure standing beneath an endless slope. A stone larger than purpose itself. An empty summit. These are not merely mythological objects. They are psychological architecture. They reveal how human beings often structure their entire lives. Always moving toward something. Rarely questioning the structure itself. And here the revelation grows larger than the individual. Entire civilizations are organized around deferred fulfillment. Educational systems. Economic systems. Political systems. Cultural systems. They all rely on a similar promise: endure now, meaning will arrive later. Sacrifice now, significance will arrive later. Keep climbing, the summit will justify everything. But what happens if the summit cannot deliver what was promised? That question transforms Sisyphus from a mythological figure into a civilizational mirror. Suddenly the mountain represents more than struggle. It represents every system built on postponement. Every institution that converts present effort into future hope. Every narrative that teaches people to live for a destination they may never reach. And now a deeper contradiction emerges. Camus is often remembered as the philosopher who confronted meaninglessness. But perhaps his greater contribution was exposing humanity's dependence on future meaning. Not meaning itself. Future meaning. The expectation that fulfillment must always exist somewhere ahead. If that dependence breaks, something profound becomes possible. Yet something equally unsettling becomes possible as well. Because once a person stops searching for ultimate justification, another question appears immediately. If life no longer requires a final answer in order to be lived, then why are human beings so desperate to keep searching for one? And that question points toward a revelation far more unsettling than the absurd itself. Perhaps the greatest burden Sisyphus carries is not the stone. Perhaps it is the ancient assumption that the stone needs a purpose at all. If the stone does not need a purpose, then the entire discussion changes. Because the deepest question was never whether a man could endure an endless task. The deepest question is whether human beings can live without converting existence into a problem that needs to be solved. This is the point where the symbol reveals its final layer. Most interpretations quietly assume that Sisyphus is searching for something. Meaning. Happiness. Redemption. Victory. Freedom. But what if that assumption comes from us rather than from the symbol itself? What if we have been projecting our own psychological habits onto the mountain? This is where the core revelation begins. The most radical possibility is not that Sisyphus learns to enjoy the climb. The most radical possibility is that he eventually stops demanding that the climb justify itself. That sounds subtle, but it changes everything. Because there is a profound difference between finding meaning and requiring meaning. One seeks. The other depends. And dependency creates a hidden form of captivity. The moment fulfillment becomes conditional upon a future answer, the present moment becomes permanently insufficient. One more achievement. One more explanation. One more certainty. One more destination. The horizon keeps moving. The stone keeps rolling. The summit remains empty. In this sense, The mountain is not merely a symbol of labor. It is a symbol of psychological postponement. A life spent waiting for existence to finally explain itself. And here is the insight many people miss. The figure at the center of the myth is not trapped because the task repeats. Repetition exists everywhere in nature. Seasons repeat. Days repeat. Breathing repeats. Relationships repeat. Learning repeats. Even civilizations rise and fall through recurring patterns. Repetition alone is not the source of suffering. The hidden source is resistance to repetition. The demand that reality become something other than what it is. Suddenly the role of the central figure becomes much clearer. He is not a hero because he conquers the mountain. He is not influential because he defeats fate. His legacy emerges because he exposes a conflict embedded in nearly every human life, the tension between reality as it exists and reality as we insist it should be. This is why the symbol continues to survive across centuries. It points toward a psychological structure that transcends culture, politics, religion, and historical period. Human beings continually negotiate with reality. They negotiate with aging, with uncertainty, with limits, with change, with impermanence. The mountain changes shape, but the negotiation remains. And now the most unsettling implication appears. Perhaps the question was never whether a person can create meaning in a meaningless universe. Perhaps the deeper question is whether meaning itself was the wrong objective. What if consciousness reaches maturity not when it discovers a final answer, but when it no longer requires one? That possibility carries enormous consequences. It shifts the focus from achievement to relationship, from destination to participation, from certainty to engagement. The figure beneath the stone ceases to represent a victim of circumstance and begins to represent something else entirely, a consciousness learning how to exist without guarantees. And that is where the mystery surrounding the philosopher becomes impossible to ignore. If this interpretation is correct, then he may not have been defending happiness at all. He may have been pointing toward a different form of freedom, one so unfamiliar that generations of readers translated it back into the language of happiness because they could not imagine anything beyond it. But if that is true, then the consequences extend far beyond one myth, one book, or one philosopher. They reach into education, ambition, success, identity, and the stories entire societies tell themselves about what makes life worth living. The question now is not whether this revelation is inspiring. The question is what happens to a civilization built on promises of future fulfillment when people begin to suspect that fulfillment was never waiting at the summit in the first place. If fulfillment was never waiting at the summit, then we are left with a consequence far larger than a single philosophical argument. We are forced to reconsider the architecture of modern life itself. Because entire systems are built around a simple assumption that meaning exists somewhere ahead of us. Education promises future significance. Careers promise future accomplishment. Markets promise future satisfaction. Politics promises future solutions. Even personal development often promises a future version of ourselves that will finally feel complete. The assumption is so deeply embedded that most people never notice it. Yet the revelation we have been following points toward something unsettling. If the search for final fulfillment becomes endless, then many of our most celebrated achievements begin to resemble another ascent up the mountain. Different stone. Different landscape. Same structure. This is where the legacy of the symbol becomes impossible to ignore. The enduring influence of this figure does not come from mythology. It comes from recognition. Across generations, people continue seeing themselves in that image because it exposes a pattern that repeatedly emerges wherever human beings attempt to build meaning. The pattern is not struggle. Human beings have always struggled. The pattern is expectation. The belief that one more accomplishment will permanently settle the question of existence. One more success. One more answer. One more breakthrough. Yet history offers a different lesson. Great empires expanded across continents and disappeared. Revolutionary ideas transformed societies and were replaced. Industries rose, dominated the world, and faded. Entire generations chased visions of prosperity that looked inevitable in one century and naive in the next. The stone changes shape. The movement remains. This creates a profound psychological consequence. The moment people realize that no achievement can permanently resolve the human condition, they face a crossroads. One path leads toward cynicism. If nothing lasts, why care? If every summit becomes another beginning, why climb at all? But another path also becomes visible. Not optimism. Not pessimism. Something more difficult. Participation. The willingness to engage with reality without demanding guarantees from it. That may be the hidden legacy buried beneath the symbol. Not happiness. Not victory. Not even meaning in the conventional sense. A different relationship with uncertainty itself. This is why the image remains so powerful, a solitary figure beneath a vast slope, an empty summit above, a stone larger than any promise of permanence. The image survives because it captures a tension that technology cannot solve, wealth cannot eliminate, and progress cannot fully erase. Human beings continue asking questions larger than their achievements. And that tension continues shaping cultures, institutions, and individual lives. Yet there is also a cost. A significant one. Once a person sees the pattern, it becomes difficult to return to the comforting assumption that fulfillment is waiting somewhere just beyond the next milestone. Awareness changes the landscape. The mountain looks different. The horizon looks different. Even success looks different. The reward is greater clarity. The price is the loss of certain illusions. And perhaps that is why this symbol continues to generate debate long after its original context disappeared. It refuses to provide a final answer. It leaves behind a legacy of unresolved tension. A question that survives every interpretation. Because even after all of this, one mystery remains untouched. If human beings do not need ultimate certainty in order to live, why do we repeatedly create stories that promise it? Why does every generation build new mountains, new summits, and new versions of the same promise? And perhaps most importantly, what does that impulse reveal about the deepest needs of human consciousness itself? Perhaps that is why this image refuses to disappear. Not because it gives an answer, but because it quietly changes the question. For most of human history, people have asked how to obtain meaning. How to secure it. How to prove it. How to protect it from uncertainty, loss, and time. Yet the enduring legacy of this symbol may be that it redirects our attention away from meaning as an object and toward meaning as a relationship. Not something possessed, but something lived. Not something stored at the summit, but something expressed in the act of engaging with reality itself. And that distinction matters more than it first appears. Because human beings do not live inside philosophical systems. They live inside ordinary moments. A conversation that ends too soon. A goal that takes years to reach. A season of work that produces less recognition than expected. A dream that changes shape after it is achieved. Life is rarely experienced as a grand narrative. More often, it unfolds through repetition, uncertainty, and unfinished chapters. That is why the image remains so powerful, a solitary figure, a vast slope, a stone that never stays where it is supposed to stay, and an empty summit that refuses to deliver a final resolution. These fragments persist because they are larger than the story that produced them. They become mirrors. And perhaps the most surprising legacy is this: the figure at the center of the image never becomes important because of what he accomplishes. He becomes important because he exposes something fundamental about the human condition. We are creatures who seek permanence in an impermanent world. Certainty in an uncertain world. Completion in a reality that remains unfinished. We build identities, institutions, philosophies, and civilizations around those desires. Sometimes those structures help us. Sometimes they limit us. But they always reveal something about what we fear, what we hope for, and what we believe existence owes us. The deeper reflection is not about whether one philosopher was correct or mistaken. The deeper reflection concerns why his interpretation continues to resonate. Why generation after generation returns to the same image. Why a person standing beneath a stone can still speak to people surrounded by technology, abundance, information, and opportunity. Perhaps because the central tension never disappeared. The tools changed. The environment changed. The language changed. Yet the confrontation between human consciousness and reality remains. We still encounter limits. We still encounter uncertainty. We still encounter the gap between expectation and experience. And we still search for a way to live honestly within that gap. Maybe that is the final insight. The lasting value of this symbol is not that it teaches happiness. It is not that it proves meaning. It is not that it resolves the conflict. Its value lies in its refusal to let us escape the question. It forces us to look directly at the relationship between what is and what we wish were true. Between the mountain we inherit and the stories we tell about it. Between the stone we carry and the assumptions we attach to its weight. And perhaps the most important thing is not whether the figure beneath the stone found freedom, meaning, or peace. Perhaps the more difficult question is what we reveal about ourselves through the answers we choose to give. Because in the end, the mystery may never have been hidden inside the mountain at all. It may have been hidden inside the observer, quietly waiting to be discovered every time we look at the stone and ask what it means.